Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to yet another fall publishing webinar. I'm Chris Beytes, editor of GrowerTalks, Green Profit, and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session called Best IPM Practices for Piercing and Sucking Insect Pests. That's quite a mouthful. Not as big a mouthful as those piercing and sucking insects are taking out of your plants, though, my friends. So we're going to spend an hour or so today talking about that. And I'm glad you joined us for that because it's a big topic. And we're going to cover the biggies of the piercing and sucking insect world. You know, aphids, whiteflies, scales, mealybugs. They've been problems for as long as growers have been growers, and I think they're going to stay that way. Hey, I know a little bit about some of these suckers myself. When I was a Florida grower doing poinsettias, I grew whiteflies the size of moths, and I could have used a session like this. And those moths were resistant to Temic, no less. But anyway, well, I've got experts who are going to help me out. Always have experts because I'm not the expert. And they're both from BASF today, our fine sponsor. So first up, a technical service specialist covering Western turf and ornamentals. She is Jennifer Browning, but we know her as Jen. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, thank you.
Now, where are you broadcasting from out west somewhere? We can only presume.
Yes, out in the Wild West. I'm in Boise, Idaho.
Very good. And what territory do you cover for BASF from Boise, Jen?
I cover from Minnesota to Hawaii, so all over the Wild West. It's quite a big footprint.
Wow, and sometimes you just got to go to Hawaii if you look for those bugs and diseases, don't you? You got to make that trip.
You do, absolutely. I have to see them in person.
And you've worked for BASF for 9 years now, and I understand you said something about you finally, ever since college, which was 3 or 4 years ago, finally have a vegetable garden. What's that all about? Why did it take so long?
Since I graduated. Well, there's a slight silver lining to that shelter in place, which is that I'm home and can plant things.
Oh, you know, no traveling to Hawaii, Wyoming,
Exactly.
or anyplace else. I got you. All right.
It's true.
Well, next up, and maybe you see a box with a name on your screen there, Jen's colleague from the other side of the country, Peggy Jean Clanton, but we know her as Peggy. Welcome, Peggy.
Hi.
All right, and where is the other side of the country? I know where it is, but tell us.
I'm in Sarasota, Florida.
Sarasota, Florida. How nice. You are the Florida sales specialist. Just Florida. No
Just
Georgia,
Florida
no South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. Oh, you're from Mississippi though, right?
From Mississippi, but I lived in Georgia, Atlanta for like 30 years and worked a territory there for several companies.
There you go. Now it's something, so Jen covers, how many states, Jen?
Oh, I haven't counted recently. It's
Too many,
over 20.
20 states. Peggy covers one. That just shows you Florida has as many bugs and diseases as 20 Western states, which is pretty much true, I think. As having been a Florida grower, I can tell you it's true. So you must see some interesting things down there, Peggy.
Oh, yes, it's beautiful down here, and it's the wild, wild west. It
is, especially when you get in off the beach. You get around Pahokee, Belglade, Okeechobee. I know those. I know some of those interstate towns there. Well, meanwhile, I'm working the controls from the Ball Publishing remote studios in world famous River Ridge, where I the annual River Ridge report, and I'll be doing that right around the 4th of July here to see if my neighbors are actually out and gardening. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. First thing, you can, as attendees, you can adjust your view to either see like whoever's speaking nice and big, or you can see us in a gallery view. There should be a little button, I think, in the upper side of your screen or something like that. There's also a Q&A area where you can type in questions, and I will shoot them to Jen or Peggy as appropriate, either as we go along, or I'll save them for the end. Kind of just depends on how things are flowing, and we'll see what happens. And people always ask, is this webinar going to be recorded? Either they have to leave early or they want to watch it with a friend, watch it again or share it with a colleague. And let me share my screen and where it's going to be. It is right there. Okay, growertalks.com/webinars. And who just said uh-oh? Never say uh-oh in a webinar.
That was me.
It scares me to death. It's like, well, we lost the connection. Hopefully we won't lose any connections. We're at the mercy of the internet here. But anyway, that is where we're going to, you will find the archive. Conveniently enough, it's the exact same place where you signed up. So That's all my housekeeping. And you're going to share your screen now and take it away with the presentation, Best IPM Practices for Piercing and Sucking Insect Pests. Fire it up.
Here we go. Are you able to see it?
Looks beautiful.
Great.
Take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad to see a good turnout. I've been sheltering in place like many of you and really missed seeing faces, so I'm glad we could all get together here today. We're talking about best management practices for integrated pest management of piercing and sucking insect pests, but we'll switch over to some shorter names, IPM and BMPs, as we move along here. One of the things that we wanted to do was put some faces with the names if you don't know us personally and tell you a little bit more about us. I've been in horticulture now for about 17 years. I've worked in retail and wholesale growing operations, and I graduated from Oregon State with degrees in production horticulture and also in entomology before I came to work for BASF. So what I do in technical service is some product development, and then one of the best things I get to do is work directly with growers to solve problems, develop products, and develop best management practices, which is what we're talking about today. Peggy?
Yes, Jen, thank you. Thank you. I'm the Florida sales specialist for BASF Ornamentals, working very closely with my distributors and my growers in the state of Florida, helping to provide solutions and support with chemistry and biologicals. I started with BASF in 2013. It's the best day of my life. It's a dream job. I love it. And I was working the Southeast United States in ornamentals and turf. And then in 2016, I was lucky enough to get transferred to Sarasota, Florida, where I worked the entire state of Florida for ornamentals for BASF. And I got my start in the industry, though, with Helena Chemical. I was a distributor rep for 10 years for them and a branch manager for like 4 years. And then went on to work for Cleary Chemical for 9 years as a manufacturer's rep. And so here we are today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peggy. So as you can see, between the two of us, we have some interesting experience covering a lot of the country and a lot of different jobs. But that may beg the question of where do these best management practices come from? So obviously we rely a lot, all of us and you, on those land-grant university extension researchers and professionals who help develop products, and they also help develop use patterns and the best ways to get the best results from the tools that you have available. Some other sources of information are breeders. Breeders provide agronomic programs with the plants that they sell, so they might give you a very detailed fertility regime. We do industry research as we develop new products. We work directly with those universities and also with private consultants. And we also do market research to determine what are the needs of the industry, what kinds of things are you looking for, and what kinds of questions do you need answered. Let's keep in mind that we also rely on those innovators, those inventors, those early adopters. Those are people who are developing things like the surfactants and adjuvants that we use to enhance the results that we get, people who work with biologicals and the best way to use those, and also people who are developing new equipment that helps us get better coverage and better results that way. Finally, the best place for best management practices is you guys. So as you might imagine, sometimes customers tell us things and ask us not to discuss them publicly, and therefore we won't be talking about those. But there's this big body of knowledge and information in best management practices that you guys are so generous with. You tell us how you get the best results, and that's what we're talking about today, those best management practices that we learn from growers and all these other great resources and the experience that you have in the industry. So changing tacks a little bit, why are we focused on piercing and sucking insect pests? Well, first we have the Mothra-sized whiteflies that Chris was talking about. And this photograph is an example of something that I found in my garden last week. So I went out and I was pulling some weeds from my beds, and I pulled out this very small prickly lettuce plant. And when I turned it over in my hand, there were a bunch of aphids. In fact, there were 44 female aphids. Well, I love to do the math on the way populations grow. And when you look at those 44 aphids and you assume that each female can produce between 50 and 100 offspring, that means about 30 days later, you can have 2,200 aphids. And 30 days after that, you can have over 100,000 aphids. So this is one of the reasons that piercing and sucking insect pests tend to be a focus for us, because they're really good at A, hiding, and B, building up really big numbers before we even realize that they're there. So we'll talk a little bit about that, how to know that they're there and how to respond to them when we have those populations. So let's get started with our first best management practice. Number one, know your enemy and know your friends. As Chris said, when we talk about piercing and sucking insect pests, we're talking about 4 groups of pests. We're talking about aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, and scale. And when you wonder why are they grouped that way, it's because when they're training you as an entomologist, they group everything by its mouth parts, by the type of mouth parts and the type of damage that it does. These 4 groups are all very closely related, but we'll see in some of the photographs that we take a look at, they don't look anything alike. So let's take a look. Let's start off with this small colony of aphids and point out a couple of things. If you know Suzanne Wainwright, the bug lady, what she likes to say about aphids is that they're baby cannons. And this is a really great way to describe them, because what aphids do is they give live birth. And they also go through kind of a semi-change as they grow. So they look a lot like the adult when they're first born, and they go through a few different instars until they get to that reproductive adult. In this colony that you see, you have all of the life stages. You've got those first instars, second, third, and the adult, and you also have males. So those are the winged individuals that you see in this photo, and they're typically going to come at the end of the season. Most of the aphids that you deal with on your crops are going to be female. The other thing that you see in this photo are some little white critters. We'll talk about those in just a moment. But the thing that we want to remember is aphids are pretty easy to identify, probably the easiest next to whiteflies. And you can see those 2 little tailpipes, which we call cornicles, that come off the back of the aphid. And that's a good indicator that those are in fact aphids. In this next image, we have a nice mixed population of pests. So we have a mealybug that's at the top of the growing point of this hibiscus, and that will be important to our story later. We also have one individual aphid that you see there, the little green guy, and then we also have what we consider a sign of a pest infestation, which is the presence of their cast skins. Now, when you're new to scouting and new to horticulture, it's frequent that people will see these cast skins and actually think that they're thrips, but they are just the exoskeletons of those juvenile instars as they go through the metamorphosis to become adults. In this next image, this is one last indicator about aphids. So the aphids are gone. This is the end of the season on this particular cornice that I have in my front yard, but what I found are the mummies. So this is evidence that's left behind after a parasitoid wasp, and parasitoid just means an insect that parasitizes another insect. That parasitoid wasp has laid an egg inside an adult aphid, turned it into what we call a mummy, and then emerged from the aphid and thereby interrupted its life cycle and kept it from being able to reproduce and go on to make more aphids. So that's a very good sign. More signs of the enemy. So this is whitefly, and the thing I want to point out about this is a pretty small tissue sample here. You just have a few leaves of azaleas. And what happens is the whiteflies and all of the piercing and sucking insect pests like to build up their populations on the underside of the leaf. So if you don't pick up the plants and shake them over paper, and you don't run your hands underneath or look at the opposite side of the leaf when you're walking past the plants, it's easy to miss these guys. You don't want to do that because they can very quickly build up to this kind of a situation. So this is very relevant to us looking at poinsettia and whitefly because it's just about the season when we'll start propagating and sticking those cuttings for poinsettia. If you've grown this crop before or you're growing it now, you know that in a range like this, when you walk by and you just touch the plants, you can get a nice cloud of whiteflies. But you want to be thinking about whiteflies and dealing with them before you ever get to that point. In the photo that you see on the left, you have the whitefly population building on the underside of that coloring bract, but you also have a high enough population that now the whiteflies are on the top of the leaf. So you've kind of progressed past an early preventative situation with those whiteflies. What we really want to avoid is this situation. So this is actually giant whitefly in Southern California. This pest and some relatives also exist in Florida. What you see is a very large population of multiple life stages, and the whiteflies are doing something where they create this waxy filamentous layer that does a couple of things. One thing is it makes it hard for predators and parasitoids to get to them, and the other thing is it's quite hydrophobic. So if you think about something like the webbing that you have with spider mites, this is a similar situation where it actually affords a bit of protection to the growing pest population. The other thing I want to point out to you is you see the enemy clearly, but you also see some evidence that you had some friends present, and those are the mummies or the left behind pupae of some emerging parasitoids. The way you would know the difference between whether or not this was a normal eruption of whiteflies from their pupae, when they're coming out normally, they leave a little T-shaped slit in that pupae. But when you have a perfectly round hole like that you see either on whitefly or on aphids, that's a good indicator that you had a parasitoid that's emerged. Moving along here to mealybug, note that we're back on hibiscus because hibiscus is very attractive to piercing and sucking insect pests, and we're also at that growing point again. So this is foreshadowing for something else we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Mealybugs like the top of plants, and they really like a place where the tissue is folded over like this because it affords them some protection from predators and also from getting really baked by the sun. So you'll want to open up leaves when you're scouting and look for them to be hiding in various places. Here's another example of what they do. This is a building population of mealybugs where you have multiple life stages present. You've got some juveniles, there's eggs, there's adults. Again, they're starting to produce that waxy layer that's going to afford them some protection. But what you're also seeing very clearly here is the damage that they do. So this is a foliage plant. They're feeding along the ribs on the underside of the leaf, and they're starting to distort the way that that leaf grows. So it won't open properly. The grower will either have to pinch those leaves off and grow new ones or possibly throw the plants away. Because of the way they aggregate and hang out together like this, they can do a lot of damage with just a few individuals, and this is why we want to be very familiar with them and be able to act early on when we have those infestations. Finally, scale. Scale can be difficult for new scouts because they barely look like insects. And what you're looking at here is on camellia, you've got a hard scale, but it looks like little tiny volcanoes all over the leaf. And I also freelance as a volunteer in a plant clinic online, and I get lots of questions about scale where people think that this is a gall or they think it's some kind of a spot or a disease on the leaf, but it's actually insects. The insect is tucked underneath that limpet-looking structure on the leaf. And then on the laurel leaf with the armored scale that you see next to it, the female's tucked up inside that little armored plate. They really don't look like insects. The other thing that makes these difficult is that when you make a treatment here, even if it's effective and manages to kill the insects, they don't necessarily come off the leaves. So you either have to cut the plants back, you have to wait for new growth to come in with something like camellias and laurels. That can really put you behind on production schedules. So that's why we really want to be familiar with the wide diversity of pests that fit into those four groups, the piercing and sucking. And it is amazing to think that although they look so different, they're actually quite closely related. Changing gears a little bit, let's think about some common predators and helpers and friends in the garden that we don't talk about as much. We tend to be very focused on biologicals that we buy and use commercially, and those are great, but these are some friends and some helpers that can just come into your operation on their own and provide some additional suppression and control in your program. So starting with our bigger bodied friends, we've got mantids like the one on the left. She's a generalist predator. She'll eat anything from honeybees to aphids to whatever crosses her path. She's quite voracious. These are really good guys to be supporting in a growing range or in a landscape. In the middle, this may look familiar to you and look like a flower fly or a hoverfly, but this is actually a soldier fly. And these guys do really well in areas where there's a lot of breaking down plant matter and organic matter for them to feed on. Nobody really knows what the adults eat, probably pollen, but the juveniles are very, very voracious predators. So they'll eat a lot of pests that you're having issues with, like aphids. Speaking of aphids, over on the right, we have a pretty common friend, which is a lady beetle. And in addition to the ones that people might add to their operation, if you have aphids, it's very common that they'll come in and just help out on their own. This is another friend. This one you might not be familiar with. This is a damsel bug. This is in the group with the assassin bugs. These are a generalist ambush predator. So what they do is they hide in the canopy of plants. They're very easy to miss, and they eat a lot during the day. I watch them in my garden, and they aren't very differentiating. They'll eat anything that crosses their path, but they do a lot in terms of eating even weevils, which are fairly hard-bodied. So they're really good to keep around, and if you see them, you want to make sure that your scouts recognize that they're not a pest, and you want to preserve them. Going to some of our smaller bodied friends, I have a picture here of a juvenile Aureus. So this is a minute pirate bug. You'll note that when I take pictures of minute pirate bugs, they're always on the sleeve of my clothing because they always bite me. They have a fairly itchy saliva, I find. That may be just me that's sensitive to them, but they are a pretty generalist predator as well, and they do a really good job. And then on the inset, we've got one of those parasitoid wasps that we talked about. So very, very small, and they're just laying their eggs inside pest species and reducing their numbers over time. Any one of these may not do a huge amount in terms of biological control, but when you think about them in terms of a little ecosystem of things that can kind of help you manage your pests, these guys all do a lot of work for us. Finally, friend or enemy? Frenemy. So this is an ant, a single female ant that I found, and she was a really good indicator species that I had piercing and sucking insect pests. So as you're probably aware, ants like to ranch piercing and sucking insects. And the reason that they do that is because the pests, when they feed on our plants, are producing honeydew, and it's high in sugar and it's very nutritious, and the ants want that. So it's very common that you'll see, say, a colony of aphids, and you'll find that you have ants that are actually protecting them and tending them. And the bad news is that they protect those piercing and sucking pests from predators, but the good news is they're a great early scouting tool because, like I said, I saw her and there's really fewer than 5 aphids on that plant so far. So she was a really good early warning system for me that they're coming. So that's a good overview of sort of the friends, the enemies, and kind of what we're looking at when we think about those piercing and sucking insect pests. The best management practice number 2 is that we know a little bit more about them and we know what their culture is, because we're going to leverage what we understand about them to enhance the control in our integrated pest management programs. So let's take a look at some other things to know about piercing and sucking insect pests. In entomology, we call anything that likes to hang out together gregarious. So they create these aggregations, these colonies, and that does a couple of things. With something like these giant whiteflies, the actual presence of the pest is a problem alone because no customer really wants a bunch of flies coming out of their hibiscus when they're shopping for plants at a nursery. But the other thing that this means, the fact that they all hang out together, is that they can build up very large populations very quickly, and that population can quickly inoculate the rest of your plants. How do they do that? Well, they really love tight spacing. So when you think about those 4 insect groups that we're talking about, the aphids, the whitefly, the mealybug, and the scale, except for whitefly, the rest of them are not strong flyers. Mostly what they're going to do is take advantage of the fact that we space our plants very close together, like you see in this greenhouse, and they're going to walk from the canopy of one plant to another. They're just going to move across the containers and infiltrate an entire greenhouse or a growing area. So that's important to understand because you can leverage that, and we'll talk about how you do that. The other thing that many, many insects and other arthropod pests like mites like is nitrogen, as it turns out. And I feel like when I talk to people about this, they never quite believe me. So I want to show you some evidence for where this comes from and what we actually see. So these are 3 studies that I pulled from General Crop Production. And the first one is talking about how food plants with high nitrogen levels are very supportive of not only the larval survival of pests like moths, but the other thing that they do is they improve the fecundity or the reproduction rate of the adults. So they help the larvae survive and they help the adults produce even more. In the second study, they're looking at a variety of different pests, leaf folders, stem borers, rollers, piercing and sucking pests, and they're finding that there is a very close correlation between the amount of excess nitrogen in that system and the number of pests that they have. And finally, that's confirmed in the last study. You can find many, many of these on Google Scholar that show a positive, strong correlation between the amount of nitrogen in a growing system and the amount of pests that you have. So that's something to be aware of because we have some control over that, right? And we'll talk about that. The other thing about piercing and sucking pests is obviously that hiding behavior. So what we talked about when we started, that tiny prickly lettuce leaf, just 3 square inches and 44 females, you can see how if you miss just a few because they're hiding in weeds or they're hiding in adjacent plantings, you can suddenly end up with very large populations of pests, which is what we want to avoid. So understanding these things and this final thing about piercing and sucking pests. We talk a lot about them vectoring viral diseases, and that's certainly very important. But the other thing that they do is in that honeydew production that we talked about earlier, they coat the leaf with this sugary substance, and it provides a really nutritious, good substrate for sooty mold to grow. Now, sooty mold doesn't actually harm the plant, except to the degree that it's going to reduce photosynthesis, but it's really unsightly, it's quite sticky, and it's very difficult to get off the plant. So when I was early in horticulture, one of my first jobs in a retail nursery was using a dilute soap and water solution to get sooty mildew off of gardenias. And it's not a fun job, and nobody has time for that. So that's another reason that we want to be really clear on the types of problems that we can have with piercing and sucking insect pests and what they're able to do, so we can take control prior to getting to this stage. That takes us to best management practice number 3. So this is deploying the cultural and the mechanical controls that are part of any integrated pest management program, right? We talk about conventional controls, biologicals, and the all-important cultural and mechanical controls. So one of the simple but not always easy ways to do that is to space out our plants. And I say that it's simple because it's pretty straightforward, but it's not easy because it can be quite labor intensive. So in the picture on the left, you see those mum plants are very nicely spaced. That was done by robots. And then on the picture on the right, you see euonymus out in a can yard, and they've been spaced by humans. And the thing that's really important here is that those euonymus have a pretty high population of piercing and sucking insect pests that are going to try to walk from one plant to another. But the other thing that they have is black vine weevil, which does not fly. So when the cans are tight together, it makes it easy for the weevils to move from one container to the next, spread out through the entire growing ground, and something as simple as spacing is going to allow the canopy to achieve a really nice shape, as well as reduce the amount of pest pressure that you have in the back far edges of that bed, even if you have a few piercing and sucking pests in the front of the bed. The other thing that we like to talk about, and I know everybody's sick of hearing about it, is practicing excellent sanitation. I know sanitation is not terribly sexy, but it's so incredibly important. And I've chosen a somewhat unfair picture to demonstrate that, because this is a cut flower grower, and they have a different situation in a greenhouse because they have a perennial crop. They're growing plants that they're cutting but keeping in place for 2 to 3 years, and they tend to have a big buildup of organic matter and debris on the ground. Well, having all of that debris on the ground provides a place where you can have aphids hiding, you can have whiteflies building up, and it also increases your disease pressure, of course. So being able to clean up and remove all of that debris, remove the weeds, can really go a long way in terms of reducing the populations that you have naturally building. When we think about cultural and mechanical controls, they fall into kind of 2 categories, right? So we have the mechanical controls like spacing the plants out. We talked about that. If you're working in a landscape, one of the best things that you can do for mechanical control is to open up the canopies of your plants. If you increase the air movement in those plants and reduce the overall humidity, that can drop the numbers of pests that you have right away. The other thing that you want to do is eliminate any hiding places, which are sometimes called refugia or harborages. Those are places where insects are going to hide and build up great numbers, like on my prickly lettuce leaf. And the other thing you want to be aware of is parent stock, plants that you're using as mother plants to take cuttings from, that they're not harboring small populations that turn into a big problem for you down the road. And then if you grow in a place where you have adjacent ornamental plantings, that can be a common place where you don't scout as much as you scout your crop, and you can actually build up good populations there as well. Another thing you can do mechanically is install blowers at the greenhouse doors. That can remove things like whiteflies and aphids, those weak flyers that will just get blown off of the bodies and the clothing of people who are coming into the greenhouse, so they're not inoculating your growing area with new pests. And there's some AMIC data to show that it also reduces disease pathogens and removes spores from clothing. So there's a lot of use in putting those blowers in. We talked about the importance of nitrogen and that relationship. And if you grow roses or you grow anything that pushes really hard in the spring, you see that fresh red growth, and you notice that that's where the aphids go. That's because that's a very nitrogenous area of the plant. So at times when you're adding nitrogen or the plant's pushing a lot of nitrogenous growth, that is a time when you are going to be very susceptible to piercing and sucking insect pests. And one of the things you can do is at least manage your nitrogen inputs so that you don't have excess. That's also going to save you some money and reduce your pest populations. Early in the season, with that new growth that encourages those aphids, you can go ahead and overhead water. We don't do that for the rest of the year for a variety of reasons, not least of which is disease, but it can be really useful for aphids, which are pretty fragile and pretty easy to dislodge from plants. And again, sanitation, always so important. Best management practice number 4 is preserving our biologicals. And I think most of us have some experience with hearing from folks about broad spectrum insecticides and how, although they can do a really nice job of kind of scorching the earth and cleaning your crop from anything that's moving, they do wipe out your bios, whether you bought them or whether you are just taking advantage of the ones that are in your environment. So whether you call them biologicals, BCAs, beneficials, predators, friends, non-targets, whatever you call them, if we can come up with programs and deploy those programs and tools so that we preserve those and get rid of our target pests, then that's going to be the best case scenario. So idea number 1 is if you don't recognize it, don't treat for it. When you're training new scouts, that's really important because they can come across something like a damsel bug and think, oh, this is a pest, when it actually isn't, and it's fine for it to be in the crop. So really work on ID with your folks, and we'll have some resources for that at the end. Remember that non-targets, all of those non-targets are an important food source for other predators. So if it's not doing damage to your plant, there's really no need to get rid of it. And remember that many of the predaceous larvae are pollen-feeding adults. So they're not going to do any harm to your crop, something like a flower fly. They're just going to eat a little pollen, and we want to keep their larvae around for the control that they give us. The other thing to know is that the cultural and mechanical controls that we talked about in the last slide, they work in the favor of beneficials. So having those more open canopies and having spaced out plants actually works to benefit those beneficials. And the other way to benefit the beneficials is to take some very specific precautions when you do make chemical applications. And I want to share a model with you for how that can work. So what you want to do is use the chemistry that you choose for your operation to the beneficial's advantage and to your advantage. And so here's some ways to think about that. The first is with insect growth regulators. So the important thing about including those in an integrated pest management program is that they interrupt the life cycle. When you can interrupt the life cycle of reproductive females, you can significantly reduce the number of pests that you have to deal with down the line. So for most pest problems that you deal with, you should be thinking about how you can use an IGR. And the thing that's nice about that for beneficials is they're very targeted. They typically only work on a few different types of insects. Look at the label for the IGRs that you use, and you will be able to learn which groups of insects they actually disrupt, and they'll probably leave most of your beneficials alone. The second way to preserve those beneficials is to use more modern chemistries, targeted chemistries. These are tools that growers and people in the field have been asking for forever. These are tools that wipe out the pest and leave the beneficials and any other non-targets alone. So an example from the BASF portfolio, if you're familiar with it, is sultan miticide. This is very targeted only on spider mites. What that means is it leaves your predator mites alone, and they can continue to do the work that you hired them for. Finally, oils. Oils are pretty non-selective, so you may be wondering why they're included here. Well, modern oils are actually formulated to be clean and do something we call flash off, which is sort of like evaporate, within 2 to 4 hours after you make an application. So they don't leave residue behind, and as long as you don't apply them directly to your beneficials, you can have oils in your program and also maintain your beneficials and your non-targets pretty successfully. Peggy, we had talked about some variable results that people get with insecticides for certain groups like scale and mealybug and the roles that oils play. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. Thank you, Jen. Yes, a scale and mealybug, they are so hard to control, and they also attach to the plant tissue very firmly, so it's very difficult. So last year we introduced a new product called Integra insecticide, and at the time we got the registration, we did not have our scale and mealybug research completed. So we really didn't know how well we were going to work on those pests. So we started suggesting to customers on the first application, go out with your oil because it is awesome at knocking back high populations. And what this does is it allows the subsequent insecticide application to do a much better job cleaning up and acting on the most susceptible life stages, such as the crawler juveniles. And so also oils can be act as they are an insect growth regulator as well, because they really do well at interrupting the life cycle. Jen, I have a lot of growers in Florida that are very nervous about using oils, and it's because of our humidity and our heat. And so what I try to explain to them is, if you will focus on making applications at the lowest labeled rate, and at a time of day when you are below 85 degrees temperature Fahrenheit, and you also are below 85% relative humidity, then you're going to have a great opportunity to use an oil. And in April and May in South Florida, Miami, the temperatures in the mornings and the evenings for many days were in the right climate conditions to be able to use an oil. So the modern oils today, like the ultra pure oil, they are much cleaner and reliable for plant safety. So what I would say is, get a small number of plants and get your varieties that you grow, and go out at that time of day when you're 85 degrees Fahrenheit and below 85 degrees relative humidity, and make your applications at those temperatures. You'll find that you have safety on a lot of your plants, and it's a great product to add to your spray rotation, and it's great to help you with your insect control, as well as it's a pretty economical application.
Thank you. Yes, all important points, and I know a few of you, I recognize your names, so I know you've heard me tell this story before, but I used a cheap old-fashioned oil in a greenhouse that I managed when I was new in horticulture, and I burned the entire greenhouse with oil. Modern oils are different, and they do flash off like we talked about, and that's how you get that preservation of your beneficials, but also how you get really good behavior on your plants. So just following those recommendations about staying below 85 humidity or temperature can really allow you to still use oils and get all the benefits that we always did, as well as leverage the modern oils, which are much cleaner and much more gentle on your plants. So that takes us to our best management practice number 5. This is talking about treating the most susceptible life stage. So we've drawn on some other examples of arthropods that we try to control. So think about something like mites, where it's very common that you have an IPM program for your mites, but you also need to include something very specific as an ovicide, because not every product treats every life stage. So being familiar with the pests that you have and their most susceptible life stage is a really good way to leverage that model that we just talked about. So when you think about those 3 different groups, the IGRs, the targeted chemistries, and the oils, this is the order that they go in terms of life stage specificity. When you buy a new chemistry, some conventional product, and you read the label, it will tell you about the most susceptible life stages or tell you which ones you should be treating. IGRs are also very specific to life stage, since most of them act by interrupting the life stage and preventing that maturation to the reproductive adult. Remember that oils are not picky. They don't care about life stage. They don't care about insect type. They're quite non-selective. So this is just a quick reminder of how those work as we move into the different pest groups and looking at their most susceptible life stages. So let's start with aphids. The ones that we deal with in the field throughout the year that create a problem for us, they're almost entirely in this summer cycle. They're all female, they're all reproducing, and they're very easy to kill. Most products will work on absolutely any instar. And so that's the good news about them. Like I said before, they are pretty fragile, and that's a nice thing about them. In some parts of the country, you'll also find that they're quite seasonally limited, that you have them in the spring and then they're gone. You may see another species crop up and those populations grow and then they're gone. They're not as difficult to control as the whitefly, the mealybug, and the scale, where the life stage becomes very important when you're deploying not only conventional chemistries, but also your biologicals. For whiteflies, we kind of change our approach a little bit, and the most susceptible stages are the adults, the eggs, and that first instar crawler. So one thing I want to tell you about insects that go through this more complete metamorphosis like whiteflies do is that the farther along you get on those juveniles developing, the more resistant they get to control measures. And the reason is because pupae are made to survive. So they're able to tolerate a lot of differences in humidity, in climate, in temperature, and as it turns out, many of them can kind of shrug off a conventional chemistry application. They can be very difficult to control. That's the reason that we focus with whiteflies on the adults, the eggs, and that crawler stage, that first instar of the larvae. When we get to mealybugs and scale, things get a little different. They get a little more complicated. So with the mealybugs, what we focus on are all of the juveniles between the egg and the adult stage. These are going to be the easiest to control. Going back to what we talked about with oils, oil doesn't care what life stage you are. And so if you have adult mealybugs or adult scale, you're going to want to start with an oil. That's why Peggy talked about having that be the foundation first application, because as you can see, conventional chemistry does not do a wonderful job on them. So first, second, and third instars there, those are going to be your focus. One thing I want to point out to you is that the adult female and the adult male don't look anything alike. Most people will never see male scale insects or male mealybugs, and if you do see them, you may not even recognize that that's what they are because they don't look anything like the females. The other thing that I want to point out to you is in this photo, I believe this is croton, and you can see that not only do you have a high population of mealybugs, but they've also given rise to some sooty mold there that's going to be very difficult to clean off and also very unsightly for nursery customers. Finally, our scale insects, and our target here is very small. And this is one of the reasons that people will say scale is very difficult to control, because if you start taking your actions to get ahead of them, when you're at the third instar, when you're at the adult, you will find you do not get good control with hardly any chemistry. So we really need to be focused on the egg and the first instar. Where Peggy is, and in California and Arizona, this window is very short. So your scouts have to really be paying attention. You have to know that you have adult females so that you can anticipate that egg stage, anticipate that first instar, because that's when you're going to have to deploy most of your chemistries that work really well on these. Again, note the male looks completely different. In fact, he looks like a little tiny cicada. And most of the time you won't ever see them unless you're really, really paying attention and you know the season for those, which is going to be later in the summer. So it's important that we scout regularly, not only because we need to know what pests are present and what their numbers are, but we also do need to know their life stage. Depending on the types of biologicals that you may choose to use, the life stage will also be important because some predators only eat eggs and some really like pupae and some will go after adults. Generalist predators will typically eat from the entire buffet of life stages, but it's important for you to know because it can help you choose conventional chemistry, when you want to release biologicals, how you want to respond to your changing pressure as the season changes. The other thing about scouting is being aware of those beneficials and non-targets that you have, because when you do have them, you want to maximize them. You want to protect them and not wipe them out. So that takes us to our next best management practice, and I'll tell you the spoiler, which is this might be the most important management practice that you can deploy to make your IPM program successful, and that comes directly from growers emphasizing that with us. Peggy, you've had some experiences with growers talking about coverage. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes, Jen, thank you so much. You know, growers, they can apply the best products on the market and still get breakthrough, which is very frustrating. But really, to get good results, you've got to get good coverage. And then on another situation, several growers will say, hey, I'm just not seeing the results I've seen in the past when I used XYZ product. And I'm thinking maybe they're developing a little resistance to it. And usually if you increase your spray volume, your water volume, you can clean that issue right up. And so it's so important to, when you want to get good control, train your spray tech really well. Look at your techniques on how you're spraying. There are so many different nozzles that you can use that would be a benefit. And by all means, choose the right spray equipment for the job.
Thank you. One of the things that we do to get at those best management practices that we know you guys know, when you're willing to share them with us and you'll let us share them with other people, is we'll often notice someone's getting really excellent results on a difficult to control pest. And we'll say to them, Why is your program working so well? What are you doing here? Everything is so nice and clean, when every nursery that you've been at earlier in the day has huge populations of pests. And when they tell you what's working for them, we pay very close attention, because that becomes really important information. And I have to tell you that usually this is what people emphasize. This is the thing. So when you think about maximizing your coverage, it comes in two forms. There's the human form and there's the equipment form. So let's talk about the people, because that's probably going to be the most important thing that you can control. When you think about the people who are scouting, who are making applications, who are mixing, who are calibrating your equipment, we want to calibrate the humans, right? We want them to be familiar with the speed at which they should be spraying. And when I say that, I mean, how quickly is your arm moving up and down with that handgun? We want them to be aware of their walking speed and make sure that they're not only consistent, but that they're moving at the right speed to get good coverage, both on the plant from top to bottom, but also all the way around the plant when you're growing larger specimens. And then finally, technique. We want to make sure that we're training people about the best way to actually get excellent coverage. And in some cases, what that means is that they are spending extra time with something like the hibiscus that you see in the border here. This is a crop that is at a retail garden center outside of Chicago. They display the cans all stuck together, so everything's can tight and the canopies are touching, but when they make an application, they spread the plants apart and they walk completely around them, and they train all of their people to spray top and bottom and make sure that they get the bottom of the leaves and the stems when they're making an application. We want to make sure that we're training employees on equipment calibration. That's not a very fun task and no one enjoys it, but it's very important. And it's possible when you have a new piece of equipment or new people that you get a disconnect there and you've got somebody that doesn't know. So maybe make a note on your calendar every quarter, once a year, that you go back and confirm that people have been trained. Identify the markers of good and poor coverage. So that means training people to recognize what spray to runoff means, or spray to just before runoff, or what a drench looks like versus a foliar application. If you use any products that leave a residue, that's a free spray indicator, right? So you can go back and confirm that the residue is consistent on the leaf surface and that you've gotten good spray coverage. Finally, this is probably one of the most important things that you can do to get excellent coverage and enhance your IPM programs that has to do with people, and that is equip your people to be comfortable while they're making applications. So that might mean that you offer enhanced PPE like cooling vests. These never really helped me inside a spray suit. I could melt through an entire vest of ice in about 10 minutes. But many people report that it actually does help them stay comfortable. What you want to do is make everything possible for them to go as slow as possible and take their time. And we really have to recognize that during piercing and sucking insect pest season, it's hot and it's humid, and putting on Tyvek or a spray suit or a rain suit just enhances that and makes it even more miserable. That is probably one of the biggest things that impacts how good your coverage is, because people will rush because they're so uncomfortable and they're so hot. So some other things that you can do: time your sprays, either before the sun comes up or in the evening. I've made sprays in the research greenhouse at Oregon State in the middle of the night because it was summer, and that actually did help. The other thing you can do is you can split the tasks, have multiple people suit up, so one person does the mixing and hands off the mixer to someone else who does the spraying, and that way nobody is as exhausted as if they did it all alone and were pulling that hose and breaking more of a sweat. I hear this from growers over and over. I think it's really important because I have firsthand experience of how difficult it is. Most of us do. Most of us have pulled hose at some point, and we know how hard that is. When you change gears and think a little bit about equipment, we want to be calibrating that equipment. We want to be taking really good care of the nozzles and the connections and ensuring that we're replacing items on a regular schedule, and choose nozzles that move your canopy. Go out at a pressure that's going to take those hibiscus leaves and really agitate them on the plant so that when you make a foliar application, you're getting the top of the leaves, the stems, the bottom of the leaves. You're taking enough time to make sure that that happens. And finally, let adjuvants help with the job of spreading and sticking. Take some time to validate some adjuvants that you find are safe on your plants and that you like, that behave well with the products that you use and are safe on your beneficials if that's a concern. and really use those to enhance the control that you get, because they can make up a little bit of not fantastic coverage. But really, by and far, this is the thing people tell us makes the biggest difference in their operations, is getting good coverage on the spray applications that they make. And hey, it saves you money because you've already spent the money on the product. You're spending the money on the labor of someone mixing and going through all the time to make that application. And the best way to make sure that it works is to get really excellent coverage. That takes us to our last best management practice for today. That's number 7, which is program solutions. And what I like to say about them is take what you like and leave the rest. So what you'll find is that BASF and other manufacturers, we put together programs that are based on our own firsthand experience with our research trials and our cooperators. And then we also take what you tell us works. And then we also take the best in show from around the country. What products are really doing a nice job? And I want to show you an example of the type of program that we offer. This is for Ventigra that we launched last year and that Peggy mentioned. But what I want to point out to you is that no program is going to fit your operation exactly. And you're the expert on the way that you grow and the crops that you grow. So what these types of things try to do, these tools, is give you a lot of options so that they encourage you to rotate, so that they encourage you to look at the different use rates that you can utilize for the pests that you're trying to control. And then we try to include some additional notes like timing on when you'd make an application, which products should be drenched, which products are foliar applied, but not all of it's going to apply to you. So at the bottom here, we have a whole section that says starting with a systemic drench, which is group 4s, and not all of you use group 4s anymore. So if you've moved away from neonics and the other group 4s, then you're going to be focused on more foliar materials and other tools. That doesn't mean you can't use things that are in this list. You would just pull out the products you don't use. The other way to use these that I really like is that you can use this as a shopping list for your own chemical barn. So you already have a bunch of products in there. Are you really getting the most bang for your buck in how you use them? Did you know you can use them in these other ways? So programs have kind of a plan of how you make applications, but you can just pull out the tools that you like and use them in the way that makes sense for your operation and still get the benefit of all that research and all those recommendations that come from growers and universities about what works. Some other resources that we like to make available are some guides for how to build an IPM program from scratch if you're doing that with new scouts, new plant health managers. This one is for spider mites, but you can use the same foundational ideas to build an IPM program for any pest that you're dealing with. And I really like making sure that IPM training is kind of a constant with scouts and with plant health managers, just so we're remembering what we're focused on. To that end, for our newer people who are joining in horticulture, either folks who are right out of school and haven't practiced IPM before, or they're new to horticulture entirely, we put out these guides that are IPM guides by pest. So what these do is they sort of review that life stages diagram that we talked about, where it emphasizes which stages are going to be the most susceptible. It talks about some conventional rotations, but it also points out what are the biological controls for each of these insect pests and what are some natural enemies that you can leverage in your growing areas. We talk about cultural and mechanical controls, and we talk about scouting tips for these specific pests, as well as best management practices for dealing with these pests. So these are available by PDF. And finally, we have one other tool I want to tell you about that we're really proud of. We developed this in collaboration with Suzanne Wainwright. This is our insect identification and treatment guide poster. What I really like about this is it helps new folks who are out scouting identify all of the different ways a mealybug might manifest or what scale insects might look like. And it also shows a scale for approximately what size they would be. And you know, in the sciences, we say never use a picture key. It's not accurate. Picture keys are what most people in the field use. They're what I use sometimes to get to species ID or at least get to the genus so I know what I'm dealing with. So these are really helpful for folks who are going into a greenhouse and say, they don't know the difference between a shorefly and a fungus gnat. Well, the pictures here will show. And the other thing is that we offer BASF solutions, so that's just products that come out of our portfolio, as well as IPM rotations by pests. So that includes everybody else's products, so that you can get a really robust rotation that's going to move you through the different insecticide classes to control the pests that you're dealing with. Peggy, you've sent these out to a few folks. What kind of feedback are you getting back about the poster?
They really like the poster, Jen. They're telling me it helps them train new people, really helps with the ID, and even other rotational products like you mentioned that are not just ours, but a program approach to insect control. I would be happy to send a poster out to anyone that would like one. My contact information will be at the end of the webinar. Just let me know.
I know we're going to get to some Q&As. We have wrapped up our best management practices that we wanted to talk about today with our piercing and sucking insect pests. It is a mouthful. So we have 7. And I know that many of you who have dialed in today are actually very experienced, and some of you are probably the source of some of this best management practice material. I hope you still learned something. I hope it was useful to you. And I believe we will take some questions and comments and get some feedback from Chris as well. And then we'll give you that contact information at the end if you'd like to get the 24 by 36 inch poster or any of the other resources that we've talked about today. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Jen and Peggy. Great information. Good enough information that we actually have very questions, which simply means you provided all the information they needed. But there's a few up here. Let's take a quick peek at them. Scott, who must work for DRAM because he says hashtag DRAM, but he also says hashtag start clean, stay clean, which is a great motto. He wants to know, should we concern ourselves with knowing which particular whitefly we happen to have buzzing around our poinsettias or other crops like Q-type or sweet potato, etc.? Or can you just treat any whitefly like a whitefly?
To some degree, you can, depending on what you're using, but I think it's worthwhile to know which whitefly you're dealing with. If you are using any bios, you will need to know what species. And also you want to know about the potential for developing resistance. So yes, I think it's worthwhile to know which whitefly you're dealing with. That can help you anticipate their season, their behavior, and also how they're going to respond to different controls. And by the way, DRAM person, you're who I meant when I said innovators, because you guys are always inventing new equipment to help us start clean and stay clean. Great question.
Truth. That's one of the things they do. Pretty broad question here from Matthew. Let's see if you can tackle what products are safe on beneficial wasps? Chemical products.
That's a really good question. And actually, I have a resource about that I can provide you. One thing I want to point out to you is that when you are buying parasitoid wasps, the provider should give you a compatibility list because they're going to know their organism better than anyone. So they'll be able to tell you, here are the insecticides that are not compatible. You can anticipate it's the broad spectrums will not be compatible. The targeted insecticides will be. But we also have some resources that I can share with you about more specifics, and the contact information will be at the end. If you'd reach out to me, I'd be happy to send that to you.
All right. Sandy wants some examples of modern oil.
I'm sorry, you broke up just a little bit. Examples of?
Oh, modern oils.
Oh, modern oils. Okay, well, so of course
no,
it's going to be, yes, you are.
Right, not
modern
5W30 Quaker State.
Oh, shoot, not plant safe. So of course, I'm going to give you an example from my portfolio because that's what I know. So ultra pure oil from BASF is very refined. This is what you see in modern oils, that you'll see that they'll say that they're 98, 99+% pure. It's actually the residue in those oils that causes plant injury and phyto. So what you want to be looking for are oils that are very refined and very pure. Hence ultra pure oil.
All right. Let's see. Brian says, I'm excited to work with IPM, to use an IPM. Many of the chemicals are not allowed in schools with kids. Any suggestions for chemicals when you're working around students?
Yeah, so if the school system has given you a list of no-nos, you can go to distribution or your favorite manufacturer's rep and tell us what those are and what your pest pressures are, and we can give you some alternatives that are not on the list of no-nos. If they haven't given you a clear list of things that you're not allowed to use, then they can also make recommendations for softer chemistries that can help with your insect pest problems. So just reach out to us.
All right. And Brian, if you want that poster, which you say you do, as does Rosa and a few others, hang on and we'll share Peggy's email address or contact information, and you can reach out directly to her and she'll hook you up. Let's see. Thomas had a bad infestation of aphids this year. Probably his crop did, not necessarily Thomas himself. Yes, they were hanging out on the underside of the leaves. He confirms that. This leads me to believe that only a translaminar or systemic chemical would work as opposed to a spray. Tips or tricks for dealing with things only on the underside of the leaf?
Oh my gosh, I love that question so much. Okay, so if you used a systemic product, yes, that would come in contact with them, but it would take 3 to 5 days for them to be able to get a dose, right? If you use a foliar product, you would want to be sure that you were spraying the underside of the leaves so that you came in direct contact with them. If you were using a translaminar product, you could either spray them directly and control them that way, or not get wonderful spray coverage, only spray the top of the leaf, and then you're in a waiting situation again, right? So it's going to be 48 to 72 hours before that material can move through the plant tissue and be in a place where those aphids come in contact. This is, again, why that coverage is so important. You can skip the waiting by just making contact with the aphids. Great question. Love it.
All right. Joe wants to know if there is a pre-stick dip that you could use for cuttings for prevention of these piercers and suckers.
Oh, that is so
that
hard.
Sounds tricky,
so some of this is, because some of the systemics can delay callus formation and rooting. So I can't think of one off the top of my head, no. This is where some people use a very dilute oil, but that's a little risky in propagation.
All right, let's see. Scott wants banker to use pests for the biologics that you would against these pests.
Okay, banker plants for bios that work against these pests. So Suzanne Wainwright could give you very specific information about banker plants that have an alternate host, so another aphid that can be parasitized by the wasps and therefore make more wasps for you that can work on your pests. What I can tell you generally speaking is provide pollen sources. That'll be the most important banker that you can make available. To the degree that your pollen sources are not yellow, that's helpful for your thrips populations because they really like yellow plants that have a lot of pollen. So if you can find some other things that can provide pollen for a variety of non-targets, that's a really good approach to increasing and providing some banker for your beneficials.
All right. One more here, but for anybody who I didn't get to, and the again, pretty nicely, we've released the floodgate here. So if I didn't get to you, I will provide their email addresses. You can type, and you have a good dialogue, them up, whatever you need. But let's finish up with Christopher, not me, the other Christopher, who wants recommendations for sprayers or piece of equipment when applying chemicals. He's a high school hort teacher with a smaller operation, and we want to encourage high school programs.
Oh, what a wonderful question. I love it. Yes, we do want to encourage.
Our drum guy, Scott, to get hooked up
with. The drum guy will be
drums.
in touch with you, for sure. But what I can tell you is that I don't know that the piece of equipment is as important as the training to use it and to get really wonderful coverage. And part of that is going to be maintaining that sprayer well. So having nozzles that are fresh so you're not getting big, huge droplets on one side of the spray and a tiny mist over on the other, that's going to be really important. Having your water pressure be correct for the product that you're applying, whether you're trying to spray to runoff or just get really nice coverage. Training is really going to be the thing to focus on. As Chris said, we really do want to support people who are coming into the industry, so the contact information will be available. If you would get in touch with me, I would be happy to give you some resources and also make myself available to talk to your students about spray technique.
Can you have good success, Peggy, this is a question maybe for you, with say a pump up or backpack sprayer for a real small operation where, of course, your nozzles are going to be different, the pressure is always variable. Is that a good way for students to learn pest control?
Well, it's a tool. I wouldn't say it's the best, and I wouldn't say necessarily that it's the worst. It really depends on what you're going after, what pest you're going after, and your water volume, being able to see where you sprayed.
Right. And I think at the same time, learning how to operate and maintain a real sprayer, albeit a small one, that you might encounter when you go to your first job in horticulture at a bigger greenhouse, that would be invaluable as well. Well, Jen, pop up that slide with your contact information, if you would, for those thousands of folks who seem to want the poster and more information.
Wonderful. And if I can just say one more thing about sprayers, it's that good technique can make up for a cheap, tiny sprayer, but bad technique can take a very expensive, beautiful sprayer and turn it into a hand pump. Really, the technique is going to be the key thing. And here is our contact information.
All right, everybody writing that down. And I will say, as you jot it down, because I'm about to make it go away, that that if you miss it, or if you lose a piece of paper, you can't read your own writing, which is usually my problem. The webinar will be archived, and I'll show you where that is with my screen share. I need to make an easier way to do this. There it is. Same place you signed up. What could be easier? You go to growertalks.com/webinars, click the link. You'll be able to watch this webinar again. I should have it up there within an hour or so of now.